August 6th, 1945 Seto Inland Sea, Japan. The morning began like any other for the men aboard the cruiser Tone. The sea was glass smooth, the wind barely a whisper, and the air thick with midsummer humidity. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Masao Kobayashi wiped a film of sweat from his brow and raised his binoculars toward the coast. The sun hovered low above Hiroshima Bay, painting the water with molten gold. Far beyond, the city still slept beneath a haze of blue morning smoke from kitchen fires. "Calm day for August," he muttered. The gunnery officer beside him grunted agreement, marking the hour, 8:14. Below deck, the watch changed shifts. Sailors traded posts, half awake and already yearning for noon rice. None had the faintest sense that, within seconds, the world would divide into before and after. Then it happened. At 8:15 a.m., a light unlike any born of nature or man erupted across the horizon. It was not a flash so much as an eruption of existence itself. White, blinding, absolute. Shadows vanished. Color ceased. The entire sea turned silver, as though someone had poured liquid metal across the waves. Officers dropped their coffee cups and clutched the rails, eyes seared even through squinted lids. "Kami yo!" someone gasped. Dear God! A fraction of a second later came the shockwave. The ship's hull groaned, cables snapped taut, loose equipment clattered across the deck. The concussion rolled over the Tone like the fist of a giant, bending antennae and rattling every bulkhead. Farther astern, sailors on the Kinu ducked instinctively, believing they were under air attack. Yet there was no drone of bombers, no shriek of diving engines, only a roaring wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. When the light dimmed enough to open their eyes, they saw it, a boiling column of smoke rising from where Hiroshima had been. At first it was a pillar, straight and dense, then it twisted and blossomed outward, its upper crown flattening into an immense, pale mushroom that dwarfed the mountains. Reds and blacks mingled like oil in water, flashing with inner lightning. The men had witnessed countless air raids, but nothing that behaved like this, a single detonation. Silent now, yet still growing, still reaching. "Report from shore batteries?" Captain Takeshi Kajiwara demanded. The radio officer's hands shook as he turned the dials. Static hissed, broken by fragmented voices. Hiroshima lost contact, blinding light, total destruction, then silence. Every circuit overloaded. The captain looked to the east again. "That was no ammunition dump," he whispered. From 20 miles out, the city's outline had disappeared behind the swelling cloud. The officers on deck stood motionless. Ash began to fall upon the water, soft grey flakes that hissed when they touched the sea. The smell reached them moments later. Metallic, bitter, scorched. "Smells like burnt iron," one petty officer murmured, brushing it from his sleeve. Kobayashi lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling. In his lenses, 1,000 tiny details flickered. A bridge igniting like a matchstick, river water boiling, a cluster of rooftops collapsing into smoke. He could make out none of it clearly, yet his mind filled the blanks. He had family inland. He thought of his sister's paper shop on Kokutaiji Street and realized he might never again see her handwriting. "Captain," he said hoarsely, "should we send a medical party?" Kajiwara hesitated. The officer of signals whispered, "No port remains to dock at." They watched in silence as the cloud kept climbing, mile after mile, until it reached heights no storm ever touched. Its base was red like a furnace, its heart black, and its top pure white against the sky. The birth of a new element of war. By 8:30, messages were cascading through every command channel of the combined fleet. Some claimed Hiroshima arsenal had exploded. Others blamed American incendiaries. One desperate report from Etajima Naval School described heat so intense it ignites flesh at distance. None understood. Each explanation was too small for the reality looming before them. Kobayashi's thoughts drifted to the years of War Pearl Harbor, Midway, Leyte. For all the death he had seen, it had always carried the logic of weapon against weapon, courage against courage. What he saw now was beyond courage. It was final. If one bomb can do this, he thought, then there is nothing left to fight. The sun climbed higher, but its light seemed pale beside the ghostly glare still radiating from the cloud. Tiny ripples on the water sparkled with drifting ash, and for a moment the entire bay shimmered like molten glass. Sailors wiped their faces, unsure whether the moisture on their cheeks was sweat or tears. At 9, the engine room requested orders. Kajiwara gave none. What command could he issue when every assumption about war had just disintegrated? Finally, he said, "Maintain position. Observe." The ship remained anchored amid stillness, the crew staring east as if transfixed by a divine punishment. Hours passed. The column thinned but refused to die, its remnants forming a veil that stretched across half the horizon. The Navy men of tone ate nothing that day. Even the gulls had fled. The silence of the sea was so profound that every creak of the hull sounded like a confession. When evening came, the sun sank blood-red behind the residue of the blast, turning the smoke into dark wine. Kobayashi stood alone on the forecastle, his uniform coated in fine ash. He thought of all the times Japan had spoken of sacrifice, the glory of dying for the emperor, the honor of fighting to the last shell. Looking at that terrible cloud, he understood there would be no last shell, no glorious end. There was only this light, heat, and the unmaking of everything human. A sailor approached quietly. "Sir, should we record what we saw?" Kobayashi nodded. "Write it down, but no one will believe it." In the distance, faint echoes rolled over the water. The delayed thunder of mountains collapsing, perhaps, or the sky itself still shuddering. The lieutenant felt it vibrate through the soles of his boots. He looked upward once more. The upper rim of the cloud had spread into thin cirrus streaks that glowed orange in the setting sun, beautiful in a way that made his stomach twist. The day ended as it began. Silent, suffocating, unreal. That night, as the tone drifted at anchor, a fine ash continued to fall, dusting the decks and the men alike. In the dim red glow of the emergency lamps, the particles sparkled like tiny stars. Kobayashi brushed some onto his palm. It was warm. "Maybe this is what the end of the world feels like," he murmured. Below, the logbook recorded the event in dry naval language. 081, 5 hours, extraordinary explosion observed over Hiroshima, nature unknown. Damage to city total. Awaiting instructions. But among the crew, no one needed instructions. Each man already knew, though none dared speak it aloud, that the war they had fought, the empire they had bled for, had just ended in a single heartbeat of impossible light. By the time the strange ash drifted as far as Kure, the entire naval base was already awake. It was 9:20 a.m. And the officers on duty at the Combined Fleet headquarters had just seen the same light. Kobayashi had an unbearable glare over the mountains, followed by a pressure wave that rattled every window in the harbor. At first, men assumed a fuel depot had gone up in Hiroshima, but then came the reports urgent, frantic, impossible. City gone. No communications. Thousands missing. Area flattened. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, stood rigid at the center of the command bunker. The operations room was buried deep beneath Kure Hill, its walls lined with maps, telephones, and clocks showing Tokyo, Saipan, and Manila time. It had survived years of bombing raids, but today it felt as if the roof itself was trembling. A single white lamp swung slightly overhead as aides rushed in and out, clutching flimsy radio transcripts. Fukudome took one and read aloud. Observation ship in Hiroshima Bay reports massive column rising to 60,000 feet. No signs of aircraft. Contact lost with all shore batteries. He lowered the paper, eyes narrowing. 60,000? Yes, sir, the communications officer stammered. It's been confirmed by 3 ships. Fukudome turned to his deputy. That's higher than a typhoon cloud. What kind of explosion does that? No one answered. The air reeked faintly of ozone, an acrid metallic tang filtering in from the ventilation shafts. Dust trickled from the ceiling. Outside, the world had turned a strange amber hue. The sunlight filtered through haze. By 10 a.m., telephone lines to Hiroshima had gone completely dead. The civilian exchanges in Fukuyama and Iwakuni reported no signal, only a constant high-pitched hum. Engineers tried to reach inland stations via field telegraph, but found every route blocked. Even messenger planes had not returned. Inside the bunker, the chatter became desperate. Could the Americans have struck the arsenal? Perhaps a chemical attack? A new type of incendiary? Each suggestion fell apart under its own absurdity. Incendiaries burned, but they didn't erase entire districts in a single pulse. Chemical gas spread slowly. This had been instantaneous, and no known bomb could flatten concrete over a radius of miles. At 10:30, the doors burst open and a junior officer from Itajima Naval Academy stumbled in, uniform singed. He had arrived by launch from the opposite shore, his face still grey with shock. Sir, Hiroshima is gone. Fukudome stepped forward. Gone? What do you mean gone? The young man swallowed hard. I saw it from the hill at Itajima, the city's center, nothing but smoke and fire. I could see the riverbeds glowing red. He hesitated, shaking his head. People were burning on the water. A murmur ran through the room. A captain scribbled notes on his clipboard, but stopped midway, hand trembling. Did you see aircraft? No, sir, just one. A single B-29 heading east before the flash. That silenced everyone. One plane, one bomb. Impossible, and yet undeniable. By noon, Kure's weather station reported atmospheric disturbances above Hiroshima. Strange, shimmering waves of heat reaching into the upper atmosphere, visible even to the naked eye. The column of smoke had stabilized into a vast mushroom shape, drifting slowly south with the wind. It could be seen from as far as Shikoku. Civilians on the streets pointed and whispered, "The gods are angry." Inside the base, Admiral Fukudome gathered his senior officers. They stood around the situation map in near darkness, only a few candles flickering due to power cuts. "Gentlemen," he began, "this is no ordinary bomb. Our reports speak of buildings vaporized, of glass fused into sand. We must assume it is a new weapon of extraordinary power." The silence that followed was heavy with the unspoken. If the Americans had one, they might have more. And if they could destroy Hiroshima in seconds, no city in Japan was safe. A young science officer, Lieutenant Nishida, cleared his throat. "Sir, could it be atomic?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Only a handful of officers present understood its meaning, having read scientific journals before the war. "Impossible," said one. "Atomic energy is theoretical." Another muttered, "If it were possible, it would mean he stopped himself, unable to finish." Fukudome paced slowly. "Even if such a thing exists, we cannot confirm. Until then, we will treat it as a super bomb. Notify Tokyo immediately." They did, though. The line to the capital crackled with interference. The message that reached the Imperial General Headquarters was brief. Unprecedented explosion, Hiroshima 0815. City annihilated. Nature of weapon unknown. Casualties beyond estimate. In Tokyo, The telegram was handed directly to General Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff. Within the hour, the Imperial Palace itself knew. Back at Kure, the afternoon wore on in eerie quiet. The sky dimmed, filled with drifting ash that settled over docks and shipyards. Workers paused mid-task, staring toward the northeast where a grey column still loomed above the horizon like the stem of some alien tree. Sailors covered their mouths with cloth. The air tasted bitter, metallic, in the harbour. Damaged ships lay half-submerged relics of a fleet long shattered. The once proud battleship Haruna sat half-sunk in shallow water, her guns rusted and silent. As the officers looked at her silhouette beneath the strange sky, the thought came unbidden. Japan's navy had burned itself out, and now even its homeland was burning. Fukudome retreated to his office at dusk. He stood by the window overlooking the harbour, the horizon still faintly glowing orange where Hiroshima smouldered. In his hand was a half-finished report to Tokyo, but he could not bring himself to write the conclusion. He had fought through 20 years of service China, the Philippines, the battles that carved the empire's reach across the Pacific, yet he had never imagined defeat like this. Not through conquest, but through a single flash of light that ended a city. The door opened softly. His aide bowed. "Sir, should we prepare evacuation procedures?" Fukudome shook his head. Where would we go? He turned back to the window, his reflection merging with the dull glow of the burning horizon. Tell the men to rest. Tomorrow, we'll send a survey flight. As night fell, the waters of the inland sea shimmered faintly with reflection, a dull phosphorescence from airborne dust. No one knew it yet, but the particles glowed faintly radioactive, remnants of what science had unleashed. Children in nearby villages stared at the sky, watching the strange aurora above the mountains. Some thought it beautiful, others prayed. In the command bunker, a final entry went into the log. Unidentified explosion continues to burn. Communication with Hiroshima? Impossible. Awaiting imperial orders. And beneath that line, Admiral Fukudome added quietly in pencil a note, not meant for any report. This day marks the end of war as we knew it. Outside, the great cloud over Hiroshima began to spread, thin and grey, across the night sky. For those who saw it from Kure, it would remain imprinted forever, the hour Japan realized, though few would yet admit it, that the empire had already lost. August 7th, 1945 Tokyo, Imperial Palace. The air inside the underground command chamber was thick with heat and unease. The fans above barely turned. The capital's power grid was still reeling from the raids of July. Papers, telegrams, and coded transmissions lay scattered across the polished table, like the aftermath of a bureaucratic battle, but no one in the room spoke. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki sat rigid, his hands folded on a folder stamped Hiroshima, confidential. His face, usually unreadable, was now drawn and pale. Next to him, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo adjusted his glasses, eyes darting between the military men on the opposite side of the table. General Anami Korechika, Minister of War, stood upright, a wall of muscle and willpower in his khaki uniform, but even he looked shaken. At the head of the table sat the Emperor. Hirohito rarely attended meetings in person. The mere fact that he was here told them all the gravity of the moment. The faint hum of the ventilation system filled the silence, along with the distant sound of cicadas, the same sound that, at that very moment, chirped over the ruins of Hiroshima. The meeting had begun at 10 a.m., with the presentation of aerial photographs taken at dawn. The images were still damp from the developing bath, when they were laid before the Emperor. At first glance, they looked like abstract art, concentric white scars radiating outward from a featureless center. But the longer one looked, the clearer the horror became. Bridges erased, riverbanks flattened, nothing but shadows where buildings had stood. A science officer from the Imperial Army, his hands trembling, explained the findings. The intensity of heat was unimaginable, Majesty. We estimate temperatures above 3,000 degrees. There is evidence of objects, even bodies, vaporized instantly. No one breathed. The only sound was the soft rustle of the Emperor's sleeve as he leaned forward to study the photographs. He said nothing for a long time. Then, almost inaudibly, "How many?" The officer swallowed. Initial reports suggest nearly the entire city. The word entire echoed in the chamber. Not district, not neighborhood entire. Minister Anami shifted his weight. Majesty, our preliminary analysis suggests an American weapon of unknown design, possibly an enormous conventional explosive, or he stopped. He couldn't bring himself to say the next word. Hirohito looked up. Or, the scientist spoke for him. An atomic device, sire. The term had been whispered through the ranks since the first reports came in. Genbaku, they were calling it the origin of light. But this was the first time it had been spoken in the Emperor's presence. For a moment, no one dared move. Then Prime Minister Suzuki exhaled. If this is true, then the Americans possess a power beyond our comprehension. Anami bristled. We cannot accept defeat based on rumors and Western science tricks. The Americans exaggerate their capabilities. A single bomb cannot win a war. His voice carried a harsh, brittle edge, the last armor of a man refusing to face collapse. Foreign Minister Togo leaned forward. Minister, we are not discussing morale. We are discussing annihilation. If they can destroy Hiroshima with one bomb, what happens when they drop 10? Anami turned toward him sharply. And what would you have us do? Beg for peace? Surrender unconditionally? To be occupied, humiliated, erased? The chamber filled with rising voices, soldiers invoking honor, politicians pleading for reason, scientists warning of extinction. The noise grew until a quiet voice cut through it all. Enough, said the Emperor. Instantly, the room fell silent. Hirohito's face was calm, but his tone left no room for argument. We will continue to gather information, he said. But understand this, if such a weapon exists, it changes everything. He stood, his figure slight against the green felt walls of the bunker. The guards at the door straightened. I will hear further reports tomorrow. Until then, you will speak of this to no one outside this room. The meeting ended, but none of the ministers left immediately. They lingered, staring at the empty chair the Emperor had vacated, as if his presence still occupied the air. When they finally emerged into the palace courtyard, the afternoon sunlight felt cruelly bright. The cicadas screamed louder, the sky impossibly blue. Tokyo itself had been scarred by months of bombing, whole districts burned out. Families living among ashes, yet nothing compared to the scale of what had happened at Hiroshima. That night, Suzuki and Togo met privately in the Foreign Ministry residence. The Prime Minister poured sake into 2 cups but did not drink. He knows, he said simply. Togo nodded. Yes, and I think he already understands what must come. Suzuki stared into his cup, watching the reflections tremble. Then, God help us all. Meanwhile, at the Army Ministry, General Anami called in his staff. Maps were spread out again, showing the likely next targets, Kokura, Niigata, maybe even Tokyo itself. We will continue resistance, he declared. Until they land on the home islands, we do not yield. His subordinates saluted, but none looked convinced. One captain whispered to another as they left the room, "How do you fight a bomb made of the sun?" In the Imperial Palace, Hirohito spent the evening alone in his study. He sat before a small wooden table, the air still and heavy. In the silence, he could almost hear the distant rumble of the explosion that had taken his people a sound carried not through air, but through memory. He opened a worn notebook, the same one he had kept since the early years of the war, and wrote only a single line: Hiroshima light that swallows all. When dawn came on August 8th, more reports arrived. Survivors wandering naked and burned, their skin peeling like paper, rivers clogged with bodies, men dying without wounds, vomiting and bleeding, as if poisoned by the air itself. The physicians had no name for it, yet only that they fade within days. In another part of the city, a radio technician had repaired one of the broadcast lines. He heard rumors filtering through the ether American transmissions boasting of a new atomic bomb. The words made his stomach twist. He imagined, absurdly, that perhaps this new sun had been built not to destroy Japan, but to erase the entire world. Later that day, the emperor met again with his aides. He listened to every detail, then closed his eyes and said nothing for a long while. The men in the room exchanged nervous glances. Finally, he opened them and spoke quietly. This cannot continue. No one dared to ask what he meant. But for the first time since the war began, the emperor's tone carried not command but sorrow. As he left the room, the generals bowed low. None could see the faint tremor in his hand. As he reached for the sliding door in the corridors of power, rumors began to move like wind through reeds. The emperor was contemplating the unthinkable. Not another attack, not another mobilization, but surrender. And outside, in the ruins of Hiroshima, beneath the still rising haze, the people who had once prayed for his victory lay silent ashes on a river that no longer reflected the Sunday. August 9th, 1945 Tokyo, morning. The meeting of the Supreme War Council had just begun when the first reports arrived. A telegraph officer rushed into the chamber, pale and breathless, clutching a fresh dispatch from the Southern Command. He handed it wordlessly to Prime Minister Suzuki. The Prime Minister read it once, then again, unable to believe what he saw. He looked up. "Another city," he said quietly. "Nagasaki." The room went still. Foreign Minister Togo closed his eyes. General Anami slammed his fist onto the table. "Impossible. They cannot have another." But even as he said it, he knew that logic had already abandoned them. At 11:02 a.m., another sun had bloomed over Kyushu, brighter than anything the human eye could bear. The people of Nagasaki had seen a single B-29 glide above the clouds, dropping a small, round object no larger than a torpedo. Then came a flash that split heaven and earth. The city's Urakami Valley vanished in less than a second. The cathedral, once the largest in Asia, dissolved into vapor. The shipyards and arms factories disappeared beneath a roiling sea of flame. In the council chamber, the generals argued, but their voices were ghosts, now echoes against inevitability. "We must confirm. It could be propaganda. We cannot trust American claims." But Tokyo's intercept stations had already picked up the enemy broadcasts. President Truman's voice, calm and deliberate, was being relayed across shortwave frequencies. "We have used the atomic bomb against those who brought war to the Far East. If they do not accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." The words arrived like thunder. A rain of ruin. Admiral Yonai turned to the Prime Minister. "That means they can do it again. At will," Togo whispered. "We have lost everything, even the illusion of control." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the southwest, the few survivors of Nagasaki wandered in blind agony through a world that no longer looked real. The blast had left a crater 2 miles wide. Wooden houses had vanished without a trace. Iron bridges had melted into ribbons. A boy found his mother's shadow burned into the wall of their home. Priests staggered through the ruins of their cathedral, holding rosaries that had fused into their palms. The river glowed red, full of floating bodies. By evening, the military police in Kyushu reported that Nagasaki had ceased to exist as an administrative entity. Its local government, its hospitals, its barracks all erased. The governor's office sent one last message before the radio failed. Utter destruction. City obliterated. In Tokyo, as the reports came in, the War Council could no longer agree on anything. One faction clung to the belief that Japan could still negotiate an honorable peace through Moscow. Another argued that the Soviet Union was now the greater threat. For even as Nagasaki burned, new intelligence confirmed what they had feared. Soviet tanks were rolling into Manchuria. The timing was catastrophic. For months, Japan had hoped that Stalin might mediate between them and the Allies. But at dawn on August 9th, the Red Army invaded with a force so vast that entire quantum divisions were swept aside in hours. In the north, the empire was disintegrating. In the south, its cities were being erased by light. When Emperor Hirohito received the news, he did not speak. He simply lowered his eyes and pressed his hands together, as if in prayer. His aide, Kido, later wrote that the emperor's lips moved soundlessly, not in words of strategy, but in mourning. That night, a cabinet meeting convened beneath the palace once more. The air smelled of sweat and candle smoke. Generals argued until their throats were raw. "We can still defend the homeland," shouted one. "We have 2 million soldiers on Honshu," but Togo slammed his palm on the table. "And what will they defend, General? Ashes. You cannot fight against the end of the world." Animus' face hardened. "We cannot surrender. We owe our dead that much." "The dead," Togo replied softly, "do not ask for honor. Only the living do." Prime Minister Suzuki sat in silence through most of it. When he finally spoke, his voice was little more than a whisper. "If we do not surrender now, there will be no Japan left to surrender." The argument spiraled into the night. At one point, a young staff officer entered with an intercepted American leaflet, dropped over Fukuoka that afternoon. It showed a photograph of Hiroshima's ruins with a caption in Japanese, "The same fate awaits the rest of your cities. This weapon will end your war." Suzuki stared at the leaflet for a long time. The paper was warm to the touch, still faintly smelling of the ink used aboard the B-29 that had scattered them. He folded it neatly and placed it before him. "We are living," he said, "in the shadow of a second Sunday. Outside, the real one was setting beyond the city, casting long red streaks over the palace walls. The sky had taken on a strange color these past days, a faint grayness at twilight, as if the atmosphere itself had been wounded. Far to the south, survivors in Nagasaki watched the same sunset through eyes swollen from radiation burns. A girl stood on the riverbank, holding what remained of her father's uniform, staring at the horizon where the fireball had bloomed. She didn't understand what had happened, only that the light had come and her world was gone. At midnight, Hirohito summoned his closest advisors. He asked one question: how long before they strike again? No one answered, but the silence itself was answer enough. In that moment, the emperor made his decision, though he did not yet speak it aloud. He rose slowly, gazing at the map of Japan pinned to the wall. So small, he thought, compared to the forces now arrayed against it. The nation he had sworn to protect had become the testing ground of something beyond human comprehension. "I will address the cabinet tomorrow," he said. His attendants bowed deeply, unable to meet his eyes. That night, thunder rolled faintly over Tokyo, or perhaps it was only the distant rumble of collapsing buildings far to the west. In the palace courtyard, rain began to fall, gentle and cold. The soldiers on guard duty thought it a mercy after the week's heat. They did not know the rain carried invisible dust remnants of the bomb, falling softly upon a country already haunted by ghosts. At 2 a.m., an entry went into the Imperial logbook. Second bomb confirmed. Nagasaki destroyed. Emperor requests immediate council at dawn. The handwriting was neat, almost serene. But behind those lines, Japan was coming apart. A nation caught between fire and silence, waiting for its ruler to choose between pride and extinction. August 10th, 1945, Imperial Palace, Tokyo. The tunnels beneath the imperial compound were damp with condensation, the air heavy with the smell of wet stone and cigarette smoke. Down here, time seemed suspended. There were no windows, no sky, only the low hum of ventilation fans and the echo of hurried footsteps. Guards lined the narrow corridors, their faces expressionless, but pale with exhaustion. For 4 days, none of them had seen natural light. At 10 a.m., the meeting began. It would become one of the most consequential gatherings in Japanese history. Inside the dim chamber stood Japan's highest leaders, the Big Six: Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, War Minister General Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Soemu Toyoda. Above them all, unseen but ever present, was the Emperor, waiting in a nearby room, ready to be called if the council reached deadlock. On the table lay the document that could end 1,000 years of imperial history, the Allied demand for Japan's unconditional surrender, known as the Potsdam Declaration. Prime Minister Suzuki opened the meeting with a trembling voice. "Gentlemen, we are gathered to decide the fate of our nation. I will speak plainly. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are gone. The Soviets have invaded Manchuria. We are isolated, surrounded, and facing extinction. We must consider accepting the Potsdam terms." The words fell into the room like stones. War Minister Anami clenched his jaw. "To surrender unconditionally," he said, "would be to betray every soldier who has died for the Emperor. It would reduce His Majesty to the level of a common man." "Then you propose what?" asked Togo. "A final battle on the home islands? You would sacrifice millions of civilians for a dream of honor? The Americans will not invade if we make them pay dearly." Anami shot back. "We can inflict such casualties that they will offer better terms. It is better to die resisting than to live as slaves." Navy Minister Yonai sighed. "General, what soldiers will you use? Our ships are gone, our fuel reserves will not last another month, and our pilots are boys barely old enough to shave. You speak of fighting, but with what? Bamboo spears?" For a moment, the faint hum of the fans was the only sound. Then Togo spoke again, his tone soft but firm. "The Emperor desires peace. I have spoken with His Majesty personally. He believes continued resistance will bring only greater suffering upon the people." Anami's eyes hardened. "His Majesty's sacred duty is to preserve the spirit of Japan. If that requires sacrifice, then so be it." Suzuki raised a hand. "Enough. We are not debating abstract virtues. We are debating whether Japan will exist at all." He gestured to a stack of reports. "These are from Hiroshima and Nagasaki." Read them. An aide stepped forward, laying down photographs and medical accounts. The images showed blackened corpses along riverbanks, people whose shadows were burned into the ground, children with skin hanging from their arms. Doctors described a sickness that spread even to those uninjured: vomiting, fever, bleeding gums, death within days. The men stared in silence. Even Anami's defiance wavered. "Is this confirmed?" he asked quietly. Togo nodded. "The American president calls it an atomic bomb. Our scientists agree. 1 plane, 1 bomb, 1 city. And they may have more." Yonai spoke next, his voice almost a whisper. The Americans are not bluffing. If they strike Tokyo, His Majesty himself could perish. That sentence chilled the room. The thought of the Emperor dying, not as a divine figure on a battlefield, but as vapor under an American weapon, was unthinkable. Finally, Suzuki turned to the generals. If we continue fighting, we risk losing not only the war, but the throne. If we surrender, perhaps the Emperor can preserve the nation's spirit. The room split in two. Anami, Umezu, and Toyoda demanded conditions preservation of the imperial system, self-disarmament under Japanese command, and no occupation by Allied forces. Togo, Suzuki, and Yonai argued that any delay would bring another atomic bomb. The clock ticked past noon, then 1, then 2. The air grew hotter, voices hoarser, tempers shorter. At 3 p.m., unable to reach consensus, Suzuki made the decision that no one had dared to suggest. Summon His Majesty. The chamber fell silent as the door opened and the Emperor entered, dressed in a simple grey uniform, his face calm but grave. The ministers rose and bowed deeply. Hirohito looked at each of them in turn, the men who had waged his war, who now trembled before its end. "I have listened to all your opinions," he said softly. "I understand the feelings of those who wish to continue resistance. But the power of this new bomb is beyond imagination. If we continue to fight, we will only bring further ruin to our land and suffering to our people." He paused, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The phrase, gentle as it was, struck like a hammer. Everyone knew what it meant. The Emperor, the living symbol of Japan itself, had chosen surrender. "I cannot bear to see my people suffer any longer," he continued. "I wish to save them. We must endure the unendurable." For several seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, Suzuki bowed his head. "Your Majesty, your will shall be done." Anami hesitated, his lips pressed tight. "Majesty," he said finally, "if this is your command, I will obey. But allow me to take responsibility for the army's failure." The Emperor regarded him with sad understanding. "You have served Japan with loyalty. Do not blame yourself alone." By 5 p.m., the council adjourned. The decision was made: Japan would accept the Allied terms, provided the Emperor's sovereignty remained intact. The Foreign Ministry began drafting the surrender message, encoded and transmitted to Switzerland and Sweden to be relayed to the Allies. Outside, the summer sky had turned a bruised purple. The first drops of rain began to fall on Tokyo, cooling the scorched city. In the palace courtyard, the guards looked up, uncertain whether to rejoice or mourn. That night, Prime Minister Suzuki and Foreign Minister Togo met again. "It is over," Togo said quietly. "Now we must convince the army to accept it." Suzuki nodded, his face hollow with exhaustion. "Pray they do not resist." He didn't know that even then, in barracks across the city, young officers were already whispering rebellion, unwilling to accept that the sacred war of the Emperor could end with a signature. But for now, in the stillness beneath the palace, Japan's fate had been sealed not by bombs nor generals, but by the quiet voice of a man who had seen enough death to know that silence was the only mercy left. August 15th, 1945, Tokyo, dawn. The city was wrapped in a strange quiet that morning, the kind that usually came after air raids, except no sirens had sounded. The streets lay still beneath a pale mist. The smell of soot and damp concrete hung in the air. Crows perched on power lines over the imperial palace, their cries echoing across the courtyards. Inside the compound, everything moved with the solemn precision of ritual. In the inner sanctum of the palace, Emperor Hirohito sat before a lacquered desk, a microphone in front of him. It was the first time his voice would ever be heard by his people. Around him stood the men who had survived the last decade of war ministers, guards, and engineers, all watching as the emperor adjusted the written script before him. The room was sweltering, thick with nervous breath. The only sound was the faint hum of the recording machine. He began to read, his tone soft but unwavering, to our good and loyal subjects. The words that followed were in the formal, archaic language of the court, distant, poetic, almost otherworldly. Yet their meaning would shatter the illusion of invincibility that had defined Japan for generations. He spoke of the war situation, of the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb, and of the suffering it would bring if continued. Should we continue to fight, he said, it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. The men in the room stood motionless, heads bowed, as the emperor delivered his decision. We have resolved to endure the unendurable and to bear the unbearable. When he finished, there was no applause, no movement, just a deep, collective exhale, the sound of an empire collapsing into silence. Outside, the recording was taken by car to the NHK radio station, guarded by soldiers loyal to the emperor. For hours, Tokyo simmered with unease. Rumors spread that fanatical officers were attempting to seize the broadcast, to destroy the recording before it aired. In the shadows of the palace, gunshots rang out, a brief clash between loyalists and those who could not accept surrender. By morning's first light, the rebels were defeated. 2 officers, unable to bear the shame, took their own lives in the garden of the Ministry of War. Among them was General Anami Korechika. Before dying, he wrote a note. I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime. His blood dried quickly on the tatami mats. By noon, word of his death spread quietly among the staff. To many, it symbolized the last act of loyalty in a war that had consumed all others. At 12 noon exactly, the emperor's recorded voice reached the nation. Radios across Japan crackled to life. In Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and even in burned-out villages where people had gathered around makeshift receivers, the same voice, calm, distant, almost divine, flowed through static. Many could not at first understand the high court language. The words surrender and defeat were never spoken directly, but everyone understood his tone. Shopkeepers closed their shutters mid-sentence. Mothers clutched their children and wept. Soldiers in ruined barracks stood frozen, staring at the floor. Some refused to believe what they'd heard. Others sank to their knees in relief, sobbing uncontrollably. Across the country, men and women bowed toward the radio as if toward a shrine, their tears falling onto cracked wooden floors. In the port of Kure, where the once mighty battleships of the Imperial Navy lay half submerged in shallow water, the remaining sailors listened in silence. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Masao Kobayashi, the same man who had witnessed the Hiroshima flash from the deck of the Tone. He stood barefoot on the wet deck, his uniform faded and salt-stained. Around him, his men gathered in a loose semicircle, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow. The radio rested on a crate, its signal faint but clear. When the emperor's voice ended, no one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the soft lapping of waves against the hull. Kobayashi looked out toward the horizon, toward the faint smudge of Hiroshima Bay. The sky there was clear now, washed pale by late summer haze. He thought of the day 9 mornings ago, the blinding light, the rising cloud. The world turned white. He remembered how it had burned into his vision, how the smell of ash had lingered for days. He realized then that the war had ended not when the emperor spoke, but when that cloud first reached into the heavens. The surrender was only the formality of acknowledging what nature itself had already declared. Nearby, one of his sailors, a boy no older than 20, whispered, "Sir, what will happen to us now?" Kobayashi didn't answer. He simply watched the sea. the sunlight glittering like shards of glass across the water. "Finally," he said, "we live. That is what happens now." In Tokyo, the city seemed to breathe for the first time in years. The air carried an unfamiliar stillness. No sirens, no planes, no bombs. For once, people could hear the wind through the trees. Yet, the peace was haunted. Survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki began arriving in the capital, their bodies scarred, their hair falling out in clumps. Doctors did not know what to call the sickness, they simply referred to it as atomic illness. The victims moved through the streets like ghosts, wrapped in bandages, eyes hollow but alive. On August 16th, the emperor addressed his staff privately. "The people suffer," he said quietly. "We must rebuild their spirit before we rebuild the nation." His aides bowed, but no one knew where to begin. 2 weeks later, the first American reconnaissance planes flew over Tokyo without opposition. From above, the city looked like a sea of ashes with small islands of life temples, gardens, a few surviving blocks. Pilots photographed the imperial palace surrounded by blackened ruins and remarked in their reports, "The heart still beats, but everything around it is dead." On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan's official surrender was signed. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, wearing a top hat and leaning on a cane, stepped forward to sign the document on behalf of the emperor. Beside him stood General Umesu for the Imperial Army. Across from them, General Douglas MacArthur waited in silence. When the pen left the paper, the war that had begun in fire and ambition ended in silence and ink. Outside on the bay, thousands of sailors watched from their decks. The water shimmered under the morning sun, peaceful, almost too peaceful. The ruins of Yokosuka lay quiet in the distance, and far to the west, the ghosts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki seemed to drift above the horizon, two clouds that had changed the shape of the world forever. That night, as the Japanese officers returned to their barracks, Kobayashi wrote his final entry in the ship's log. "The empire is gone. The men sleep. The sea is calm. I can still see the cloud." He closed the book, laid it on his bunk, and stepped out onto the deck. The stars were faint, dimmed by the haze that still lingered over the islands. Somewhere, deep within the mountains, cicadas sang as they had before the bombs, their song unchanged, eternal. Kobayashi looked toward the east, where the first light of dawn began to rise. It was soft, golden, and alive, not the cruel burning light that had consumed Hiroshima, but the gentle glow of a world reborn. He exhaled and whispered to the wind, "Owari."